Hey everyone, Radical Dreamer Steve back at you with another gaming video, and today I'm talking about Shining Force, the strategy RPG that came out on the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis in 1992 and 1993, but it's also been featured in many Sega Genesis collections since then, and I believe you can buy it individually on platforms like Steam. Now, this was one of the very first strategy games ever to make it to the West, at least for consoles. It competed with other series like Fire Emblem and Langrisser. Now, before I get into this, I want to just tell you guys a bit of backstory. Shining Force 2 was the first RPG I ever played, ever. And I beat this game a bunch of times before ever even getting to Shining Force 1. So, last year is actually the first time I ever beat Shining Force 1 on the Genesis. I felt like after beating Shining Force 2 a bunch of times, I had to play the original, even if it was worse. The purpose of me making this video is really to answer a couple of questions. One is whether or not this game still holds up, and two, whether or not you should play it, and what this game should be remembered for. So let's get right into it. I want to talk about the exploration mode first, because unlike most other strategy games, even to this day, Shining Force allows you to explore. You can walk around cities, you can walk around the world map, talk to NPCs, go to stores, find new characters, and this level of exploration is something you don't really see in pretty much any other strategy RPG. There's a few exceptions, like a couple of the Fire Emblem games do have that. I think like Shadows of Valentia and Disgaea has it to some extent, but for the most part, strategy RPGs are largely menu-driven and focused on the combat, where Shining Force has an exploration mode. For me, this is a huge plus for the series since it makes the game feel bigger and more expansive, and it kind of makes it feel more like a traditional turn-based RPG system. Now, in the first Shining Force game, you're really limited to a small area. There's 8 chapters in the game, and each chapter has a small area you can explore. It might be something like 1 or 2 towns, a small dungeon, and small piece of world map area. And after you beat that chapter, you cannot return to the old ones. So in my opinion, I think Shining Force 2 does a much better job with the exploration, but it's really cool to see how they kind of started with Shining Force 1, and the exploration mode is still very much intact, even if it is a little bit dated. Because there is a bit of crypticness in the fact that you need to talk to random NPCs and you don't always know how you're supposed to progress. So this game sort of lingers between the 8-bit and 16-bit mode of RPGs, sort of that time period where narrative-driven games and character development were just starting out. And so Shining Force 1 kind of feels with the exploration and the plot like it's sitting between 8-bit and 16-bit RPG development. But I think the takeaway here for me is that Shining Force is trying to do something big and new, and even though they didn't really nail the exploration fully until the second game, there's still kind of some fun to be had with the exploration in Shining Force 1, and I think the headquarters idea is really cool. Every town has a headquarters, you can go in there, switch out your characters, check out their stats, change items, and you can even talk to each of your party members for just a little bit of extra dialogue. And with that, that's going to bring me to the story. As I said, Shining Force 1 is emerging right around the times where RPGs are starting to tell larger narratives with a bigger focus on character development and an emphasis on key events, like twists in the plot, and a plot that actually has a lot of crucial moments in it that brings it to life. Unfortunately, Shining Force 1 is very bare bones when it comes to the plot. It kind of involves an empire awakening a dark force, blah blah, it's sort of very cliche. And basically all your party members, they have some kind of initial storyline when they first join, and then they don't really play any part in the overall narrative of the game again. Now, I hear with the plot that when they brought this game to the West, they actually cut out a bunch of the plot that's in the Japanese original. I've never played the Japanese version, I don't know, but I guess the GBA port of Shining Force 1 rectifies this issue. They bring back all the plot that was cut out of the Genesis version, and they even add in new characters and plot. So when you're playing this game, expect a very thin plot line that you're not going to feel very connected to. It's not bad by any means, but it has nothing on other games of that generation like Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy III, even Shining Force 2 or Phantasy Star 4, those better RPGs from this generation. But what I will say is that despite the plot not being a very central part of the game, you will get attached to your characters based on their role in combat. You're going to spend a lot of time on the battlefield, and like those early Fire Emblem games, they don't really have deep personalities, but you will spend enough time with those characters on the battlefield to grow attached to many of them. And the art style that Camelot employs here really makes them feel very endearing. The character portraits have this sort of Western aesthetic that most Japanese RPGs didn't really touch on. For instance, you're not going to have any spiky-haired characters, and the characters sort of have a kind of Western, kind of comic medieval style to them that really makes them endearing and stand out from other RPGs of that generation. Now, I think we got to spend most of this episode talking about the combat, because really, the reason to play Shining Force 1 is the combat and the strategy. It is a strategy RPG. And while the strategy element of this game is quite dated, it's still pretty fun. What I noticed, though, replaying this game recently, was that the battles are really slow, even compared to the sequel Shining Force 2. There's kind of a cursor that moves across the battlefield, and every character, you need to actually watch that cursor go to the character it's picking, and then choose an action. And there's a couple seconds of delay when you actually get into one of the admittedly really impressive combat scenes. So this game is a little bit slow. I had to put that out there first and foremost. And to make matters worse, this game has horrible AI. I mean, it's infamous. Like, the AI feels like it's programmed to do one of two things. Like, it will always attack your main character. You could have one of your characters standing with 1 HP that could easily be killed, and your main character with full health, and the AI system will always attack your main character. So it basically means that you don't really need to worry too much with the other characters unless you're kind of swarmed by enemies. But it does mean you basically need to guard your main character at all times. And then on top of this, it feels like there's like a 50% chance that the AI is either programmed to do absolutely nothing at all, even when they can take a better action, or even worse, programmed to run away from you, which is just bizarre. So actually, the bad AI is my single biggest criticism of this game. And it makes it very easy. By the end of the game, your characters can thrash most of the opponents on the battlefield, and you don't really feel like there's enough challenge, especially with the AI. Now, there are some hard fights and there are some hard enemies, but the AI is completely baffling, and I guess it's just a growing pain in the genre. But to combat this, on the flip side of the game that makes it really fun and playable, there's tons of characters that join the party, and there's tons of different classes. You can choose from mages, armored knights, horsemen, birdmen. There's all kinds of classes. I think there's 8 in total. And there's a deep roster of characters, which means you can switch in and out characters that you prefer to use. And there's no game overs in this game. When you die, you go back to a church. If your characters die, you can revive them for a little bit of gold at the church. And you can use a spell called Egress with your main character to leave the battle immediately, and you can train up characters you might want to potentially use. This is a great way to kind of experiment with new characters and a good way to level up characters. So while there's some challenge to the game, I feel like this game's really, really fun and a little bit sympathetic to the player and how well it treats you, with the fact that you don't get game overs and there's not a huge reward for dying. There's not a huge loss for dying in battle. This makes it really accessible and fun without being too easy. Another big criticism, though, is that there are some battles in this game that take place on some slow terrain. Like, all your characters will be in the middle of the mountains, and they can't really move very far. And there's a few battles like this that take place in the mountains or desert, and they really just slog on. But if I had to counterbalance this, there's about 30 battles in this game, and most of them are really fun, and they do stand out enough from one another to keep the game interesting. And the game doesn't last too long. It's only about 10 to 15 hours, so it's not exactly a burdensome adventure. I would say with the newer remakes, I really like the fast forward feature on the Genesis Collection on the PS4, although I've gotten a bit too addicted to pressing that fast forward button. My final thoughts are on the combat, is I think the combat is a lot of fun. It isn't quite as refined as Shining Force 2 or 3 or some of those other strategy RPGs, but it still has a solid strategy RPG that holds up quite well, considering when this game was released. That brings me to a really cool but baffling part of this game, and that's the promotion system. Characters can be promoted at level 10. Oddly enough, though, when they get promoted, you would think they become stronger, right? Like, hey, you're becoming a new powerful class that should be more stronger, so you're going to contribute to the battle. But no, when you promote your characters, until they gain a few levels, they go back to level 1, and they're weaker for a few battles. Now, Shining Force 2 totally fixes this, but it is something you need to deal with in Shining Force 1. You're going to promote your characters and be like, what? Like, they're like way weaker now? Like, why did I even promote them? But once you give them a few levels, they start to become stronger than they ever were in their first unpromoted form. So what I recommend doing is either just training them and sort of grinding a little bit, or just promoting them in batches so you don't have too many of your characters that are weaker at one given time. So that's kind of my thoughts playing this game for the first time. I don't have as much time with it as Shining Force 2, but I do admit that I like Shining Force 2 much, much more, and I cannot wait to make a video on that game. Does Shining Force 1 still hold up? Yes and no. For those that are used to retro games that have a lot of patience, this is a very fun game, and it isn't long, and so I think it's definitely something that's going to have a bit of nostalgia attached with it, and it's still pretty fun. I do think this game beats out most of the competition from the 80s and early 90s. The battle system's a little bit slow and the bad AI makes it less enjoyable, but the combat still has enough of a challenge that makes it feel like an RPG that's worth your time, and there's still plenty of strategy you can employ, like splitting the party and using different classes. So I think that this game is definitely worth trying, but if you're playing it and you really don't feel it, go ahead and play Shining Force 2 because I think it's an objectively better game in most respects. And my second question, what is the significance of Shining Force 1? Well, Shining Force 1 is one of the first truly good strategy RPG games to come out. It set the stage for games like Shining Force 2, Shining Force 3, and I think it served as an inspiration for many, many games. It also made the Genesis a go-to system for strategy RPGs. The SNES, even though it had many, many good RPGs, had no real strategy RPGs to compete with the Shining Force games. Maybe in Japan this is not true, but in the West, the Super Nintendo has no real strategy RPGs, meaning that if you want to play this genre, the Genesis was the better console, and Shining Force 2 is truly still one of the best games in the genre of all time. Shining Force did something that most strategy RPGs, even to this day, didn't dare to do, which is combine the exploratory elements found in turn-based RPG systems. There's a lot of freedom here that menu-driven strategy RPGs do not offer. While it is probably my least favorite mainline Shining Force game, I still think it's really fun, and it makes me appreciate the sequels that much more. I would love to see Shining Force 1 remade with an improved story, which I know happened on the Game Boy Advance, but I'd love to see Shining Force 1 made with the sort of fidelity that a modern strategy RPG would have, with a proper difficulty and better AI. I think Shining Force 1 has the blueprints of an incredible game, but it falls short not because of faults of its own, just because of growing pains within the genre. This game deserves a lot of love, you should play it, but just expect a pretty old school experience. And yeah, I don't know, what are your thoughts on Shining Force 1? I definitely will be bringing you guys a video on Shining Force 2 pretty soon, and that is a game I much prefer to Shining Force 1, so I will pretty much be lathering that game with praise, though I will talk about the few faults I think the game has. So that's it for this week, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Tell me, do you guys like Shining Force 1 more than Shining Force 2? What do you think this game's legacy is? Alright, game on, and catch you in the next video.